Hey, welcome to the 2 Month Review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter at the University of Rochester, in which we take a giant book, break it down bit by bit, talk about it, analyze it, joke, have fun, do things. This season, Doris Lessing, Nobel Prize winner, 2007, a weird year that I keep revolving around for some reason, and her book, The Golden Notebook, a giant book about women and men and communism and other
Mm.
stuff that we'll be reading this season and throughout the next 2 months. I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and I'm joined as always by Kaija Straumanis, senior editor at Open Letter and translator from the Latvian, including the book The River by Laura Vinogradova.
Correct. Hello.
That's my best Soviet version of saying her name,
Ooh, ooh.
Vinogradova.
I
Um,
mean, got you there.
Yikes, can't do it. Also, Brian's not here this week. He wanted to be, but his car broke down with his daughter and his daughter's friend in the back. So hopefully he's doing okay. If you see someone on the side of a New Jersey highway looking frazzled, looking for help, you can stop. By the time you're hearing this, he might still be there. I don't know. I don't know how time works.
We don't know how New Jersey works.
I don't know if New Jersey allows women to drive topless, which is a topic of conversation that you've been having all day.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Not going to go back into that one on this take, huh?
No, not going to go back on them, but I will just say the short version that had a brief, I don't know how we got, oh, I do know how we got there. Had a brief conversation with our 7-year-old about the societal unfairness of not being able to take your shirt off as a woman in public without consequences.
Facts, which does tie in, like you say, ties into Golden Notebook in certain ways because there's a lot of reference to like the fairness and unfairness
Yeah.
and implicit misogyny and sexism in most structures of life. So we can get into that in a minute. But before we get started, I do want to say for anyone listening, there is a schedule that's online that we link to in the show notes every week. And for this particular season, things almost worked out perfectly where every week we stop at a natural stopping point before the end of a at the end of a notebook or at the beginning right at the beginning of a free women section of this book, except this week. This is the one week where like there's no stopping point that makes any sense. So we're going to talk about the two introductions, some background information on Doris Lessing, and then up to page 80 for this week. And then after this, that just stops in the middle of the Black Notebook, which I'll explain in a minute for anyone who's not reading along. But this is the only time that'll happen. I apologize. I try my best to make these things work out. And this one was beautiful to a moment, to a point. Cat, stop getting attacked. So, Kaya, start this off. I know this was your selection, and I have a question for you. Do you want to talk about why you selected this book for us to talk about? And then, in addition to that, what do you know about Doris Lessing? Have you read other books of hers?
Um, well, as I've been saying, the reason I wanted to read this book is that I got about, my estimate is about two-thirds of the way through it. I was listening to the audiobook actually and hit a point where I think we may have been talking about doing one-offs with the 2 month review or whatever it was, but I hit a moment and a point where I really wanted to be able to talk to someone in real time who's also reading this book. And you and Brian are easy targets for this. And I don't think you would say no to another female author. And yeah, so
Was
I
there something
just
in particular that you wanted to talk about? I mean, maybe we'll get there along the way, but if there was any particular element of this book or any way that you want to frame it for anyone who's listening who may not have ever read Golden Notebook or heard of it.
oh, that's so many things. I think the desire to talk about it with you guys was very simplistic in that I realized how much I was enjoying it and was just like, this book is fucking amazing.
Hmm.
And I really want to talk to someone about how amazing it is. I don't remember at what point I stopped, and it's been months now. It's been probably about 4 to 6 months since I stopped reading it. So I'm kind of starting fresh.
Yeah.
Um, but it just, I think it sort of wowed me in the way that when I first read Margaret Atwood's the Mad Adam trilogy wowed me with the prose and like there's the stories within stories, or I should say notebooks within notebooks. And yeah, that's
Okay.
just the simple answer to it. I had not read anything by Doris Lessing prior to this. Um, this book was one of the 100 books on that like scratch off classics or scratch off 100 books you should read posters. And it was one that had been on my list for a while. And I know nothing about her other than she won the Nobel Prize, um, wrote this book,
Okay. So let's do a
and
little bit.
yeah, and lived in England for a large part of her life.
Yeah, although she was born in what is now Iran, and then lived in what is now Zimbabwe for a long period of time,
Hmm.
she's still considered a British journalist. She's born to British parents and spent a
Yeah.
lot of time in London. So I think she's classified as British, but she was actually like spent a good formative time in Central Africa, which comes up obviously in this book
Oh
and in
yeah.
a number of her other books. So she passed away not too long ago, and I mean, I guess it's a while now, 2013. Seems like not that long ago, at the age of 94. So she lived a good, long, healthy life. She wrote something like 70 books. Like her Wikipedia page, which I'm going to cite because they have a really good way of framing her career. But there's like, I can't even begin. I'm not going to count these, but I read somewhere else that there's around 70 books that she wrote over the course of her life. So very prolific author. When she
Yeah.
won the Nobel Prize, the person who was in charge of Harper Perennial at that time was a friend of E.J. Van Lannen who worked here at the press. And it was very exciting for anyone to win the Nobel Prize. And it happens at Frankfurt, or this time it happened during Frankfurt. So everyone was like a buzz and realized that almost none of her books were in print. Like almost none of them. Like Golden
Wow.
Notebook, yes. And then maybe like three others. But the other ones that had been in print were either like basically out of print, out of stock, had not been reissued in decades. I mean, this
No
still like
shit.
I'm gonna put a fine point on this because it's something that troubles me. Is that even within my brand new edition of the Golden Notebook with these fancy cut pages and this very soft and supple cover, in the back it has a number of pages that go through like, have you read these other books by Doris Lessing? Okay, so one of those big sequences that she wrote that I'll come back to in a minute is the Martha Quest set of novels, of five novels. These are five are connected. They build one after another, and four of the five have matching covers, and the fifth one just has some bullshit that existed from some previous edition that still has that bullshit. Like they have not put these five covers matching in the what is it, 18 years since she won the Nobel Prize. And her books that are on, we'll come back to this, but a lot of her books were out of print or just not available. And I feel like this is a good in a way a good starting point because this book is about sort of like the having female voices and having female representation. And I feel like Doris Lessing as a prominent Nobel Prize winning author is way overlooked in contrast to like other male Nobel Prize winning authors, other males. If you go to her Wikipedia page for the Golden Notebook, this is a massive book that was like incredibly important to a lot of people, a lot of readers, a lot of theorists, a lot of writers. It was in 2005, Time magazine named it one of the 100 best English novels since 1923. Why that number? I don't know. I don't run Time. Um, but the plot summary is 2.5 paragraphs. That's it. Some major themes. That's it. That's the entirety of the Wikipedia article. A
Yeah.
Wikipedia entry for a mail book of this length and importance that's on a top 100 list would be at least 5 times this long. So,
Yeah.
like, I've always felt like she's sort of under the radar for which seems weird and like is disappointing because she's really interesting. Um, and I talk a lot, but just for one more thing here that I think is interesting and useful is that in her actual Wikipedia page, they do break her fiction up into three distinct phases. And I'm not sure where they're coming up with this or who came up with this, but it seems to map onto what I know. So there's her communist phase from like 1944 to 1956, which were a lot about like social issues. So The Grass is Singing, which is a book I read in college of hers, and was the first time I was aware of hers about like black and white relations in Africa. The Good Terrorist, which is a communist book, obviously. and some of these later African stories. Then they're part of the collection called African Stories. Then there's her psychological phase, which is, according to this, 1956 to 1969, which includes the Golden Notebook, which is 1962, and then the Martha Quest series of novels, which are also referred to as the Children of Violence Quintet, which
Mm.
begins with Martha Quest growing up in Central Africa and ends with like an alternate history of the 20th century with a nuclear war, World War II breaking out in the final volume of this series. So starts to drift away from the realism that's prominent in those first books, which are more, politically motivated. And then third, they refer to as our Sufi phase, which is basically the Canopus and Argos sequence of science fiction, and which is a 5 volume sci-fi books that she wrote, which are also like books I've always wanted to read. Not available in any readily,
Hmm.
beautifully packaged cover. They're just like they're there. You can order them, but they don't like. There's nothing about it that's sexy or appealing. The way that like even the Kathy Acker book that we just read had like new covers on some of them that were like cool.
Yeah.
These just don't have that, and it feels like a fuck you in a weird way
Mm.
to like her legacy and to like people readers who are interested in non-white male European writers that write big
For
books.
sure.
So it's always stuck in my craw.
Yeah,
I
no,
want to
for
get
sure.
that out there. I want to start this podcast with a little violence because that feels appropriate.
That never happens either. And you did write in your Substack about this, but remind me, which other books have you read by Doris
So
Lessing?
I've read The Grass is Singing, which I read
Okay.
in college. So what I remember of it is that it is like a book about racism and racial relations and in Africa, and that it's fairly realistic and does have like a sort of like pro-socialist, pro-people sort of bent to it, which you can talk about in terms of what that means for this book. Golden Notebook, which I read some years ago, but I listened to it and I do know reading it now on the page is a very different experience. Listening to it was like I remember. We can talk about this more later too. But when you got to like the black notebook in here and read that part of the story, I remember listening to that and being super confused because like there was no markers for like what was happening
Yeah.
on the text, and it was just like this is like a jumble of stuff. And like, who are these people again now? So this is a much more illuminating and interesting read. And I've also read
Yes.
Briefing for a Descent into Hell about a person going mad. The Fifth Child, which I really quite like, is about a fifth child who is determinably evil and bad. And the right away the mom's like, this child ain't a good one. This one's not going to work. And there's a sequel to that called Ben in the World, which I also read when I was at like that came out right as I had left the bookstore or was leaving the bookstore. So that's how I kind of like backdoored into reading about her. Now, I think the good terrorist I mentioned earlier is part of that communist space. I think that's written later, actually, than the period that they tag that onto. Just to
Mm.
clarify that for anyone who's listening, but it does kind of tie back into that particular phase because it is about like a bombing in a communist plot. So I've read a handful, but there's so many more. And the Martha Quest,
Yeah.
I was on to read the Martha Quest series and the sci-fi series, and in some ways I'm like, well, I have time for one of the two. Which one should I do? And then never do either.
Right.
Like trying to
Right.
pick a movie on Friday night.
Yep. There you go. You just end up watching Letterkenny anyway. That's me talking about myself. I will say since
I
I
almost said
started
a
this
Letterkenny line, but that will get us canceled. Let's go.
Um, since I had started reading it by listening to it as well, there was definitely this was also a book where so as with all the other books on the scratch off poster, I don't really read the jacket copy.
Hmm.
I just like I do it under this auspice of obligation to scratch off a little like 1 by 3/4 inch square or rectangle. So it took me also a while in the listening to realize that like what part of it that there were journal entries in a notebook and then there was the story itself. And then when she starts to talk about or the character Anna is recounting the novel and then the movie adaptation, which I think she very, very cutely refers to as the parody of her novel because she
Yeah.
thinks the whole idea of of a movie adaptation is stupid.
Yep.
Um, uh, so it's definitely a treat to read it. on the page.
Absolutely, absolutely. I agree with that. And I'm going to get into the book in more detail, or at least set up this first section in a minute. But I do want to get a little bit more background on her, and also like these introductions that came with it, or that preface this book. There's two of them, one that she wrote in 71 and the other in 93.
Hmm.
And the 71 one in particular, the 93 one is kind of like, yep, things are going on.
It's
But
like,
the,
wow,
yeah, like shit, this chick's
wow, we're
still
still here.
around. But the 71 one is much more interesting. But in terms of, though there, I don't know, there's something to say about both of them. But anyways,
Yeah.
also in terms of like one of the things that's interesting about her when she, this is an article from 2015, is that it released that MI5 released folder upon folder about Doris Lessing because they had her under investigation and had her phones tapped, had her
What?
followed. Um,
Amazing.
Yep, because she believed she was I mean, she was part of the Communist Party and was, a communist. They continued to monitor for years, and let me see if there is a good quote in here, but I'm having a hard time finding it. But some of them include like 2 years later, MI5 noted that Lessing was, quote, the leader of the writers group of the British Communist Party. In 1956, Special Branch informed MI5 that Lessing, whom it described as of plump build, had moved into a flat in Warwick Road. Her flat is frequently visited by persons of various nationality, it reported, including Americans, Indians, Chinese, and N-words. The report added, it is possible that the flat is being used for immoral purposes.
Oh my
Um,
God.
they also later quashed that suggestion, reporting that she had become a supporter of the European Gathering of Young Women for Peace and Happiness. Um,
Yeah.
but she was banned from South Africa and Rhodesia for various things, for supporting various communist and social causes. Um, but yeah, they had her phones tapped. They paid attention to her. They followed her. She was like influential in that way, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it take
No, it is. It is really cool. And her, I mean, she just seems like I actually want to read the her autobiographies that she talks about. Because there seems to be like a kind of like a nonchalance about it. Um,
yeah. I'm very curious to
about
see that.
most things that she talks about in the introduction, even like even down to how she dropped out of school at 14 and she doesn't make like a big to do about it in the introduction. She's just like doesn't I forget exactly what it is, but I think it's along the lines of like having a degree doesn't make you a better reader or something like that. It's like she just seems really cool, but like a
Yeah.
very demure, very mindful to use the
Yep.
lingo of the kids these days.
Yeah, and so one other thing that's great is that there are some articles if you're interested on like which books of hers are the best. The Grass is Singing, The Golden Notebook, Shikasta, which is part of that sci-fi one. Good Terrace and Alfred and Emily seem to show up a lot. For anyone who's curious about that, when she wins the Nobel Prize, she's got some great quotes here. Um, I've won all the prizes in Europe, every bloody one. I'm delighted to win them all, the whole lot. It's a royal flush. Just pretty incredible.
It's just yeah,
It's a royal flush.
that's so
Now,
cute.
this does tie into the introduction. So after this, we could kind of move into that. But in the introduction, he talks about like lists and the book being on a list and like this list making. Forget what the exact quote is, but I think that that is a reference to Harold Bloom, who
Mhm.
famous literary critic who put together lots of like the great books of the century and all these books on Shakespeare. Very very smart dude. However, maybe had some blind spots at times. And when she was given the Nobel Prize, he says, the veteran U.S. literary critic Harold Bloom has so far provided the only voice of dissent, describing the Academy's decision as, quote, pure political correctness. He said to the Associated Press today that, quote, although Ms. Lessing at the beginning of her writing career had a few admirable qualities, I find her work for the past 15 years quite unreadable, fourth-rate science fiction.
Oh,
So I don't think Bloom's a fan. I don't think that. I think that that's known before before she was a Nobel Prize. I don't think that like it's a sudden turnaround. But what a little bitch! Like what an ass!
yeah.
Like
I
go
mean,
fuck yourself, Harold Bloom.
also tough shit for him. It's for a body of work, not not the last four books out
And
of
like
70 that you wrote.
sorry you're dead and all, but like I think your
Yeah.
time's passed anyways. But Just taking shots at Harold Bloom, who was a big supporter of Open Letter at one point in time, by the way. But whatever. Life goes on. Change your mind.
Life does go on.
So yeah, so these introductions, one thing, so there's two introductions. The second one I think is the more interesting, which is much, much longer, and sort of talks
Hmm.
about the book at first is like how it's frequently categorized as a male versus female book.
Yeah.
As like this is a women's book, it's a feminist book. It's showing that women are mistreated by men and the divide between men and women and all that stuff. And she's like, that's not really it at all.
Yeah. I mean, it's not part of it,
Right.
but she's like, I have been in a false position ever since when the book first came out because it was claimed by reviewers as being about the sex war or was claimed by women as a useful weapon in the sex war. And then she says, I have been in false position ever since. For the last thing I wanted to do was refuse to support women. So she's kind of like pigeonholed into being like, yes, that's what
Yeah.
it was about.
And like she does talk about what her theme was right before that. This theme of breakdown, that sometimes when people crack up, it is a way of self-healing, of the inner self's dismissing false dichotomies and divisions, has of course been written about by other people as well as by me since then. This is where, apart from the odd short story, I first wrote about it. But nobody so much as noticed this central theme because the book was instantly belittled by friendly reviewers as well as by hostile ones as being about the sex war, or it's claimed by women as a useful weapon in the sex war.
Yeah,
And so yeah, so like her idea, which does come up in this first section, like I mean, her bringing attention to it really makes it stand out. But of this sort of
absolutely.
like idea of breakdown of dichotomies of like this kind of splitting of people, pigeonholing or giving labels to you're a communist, you're part of this, you're part of that, you're a
Yeah.
businessman. Is very prevalent in here. But like it's interesting that like I was going to pull out some of the earlier reviews to talk about them, but that's something Brian really likes, so we're going to save it for next week to talk about those early
That's
ones.
fine.
I also like that in her introduction, she takes a shot at George Eliot, which I'm not a
Yeah.
big Middlemarch fan, but she's like George Eliot is good as far as she goes. I think
Yep. I love that too. Yeah.
to have him like faint
She did
praise.
her Victorian best.
She did her Victorian best. I also really like what she says about her goal. My major aim was to shape a book which would make its own comment, a wordless statement, to talk through the way it was shaped, which is something that I'm always obsessed with in books that like kind of create themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's super useful. I do also think the most interesting part of this, though, to me, she also amazing. This woman seems like the greatest to hang out with, like
Yeah.
totally
Yeah.
like the greatest to hang out with, especially in her later years, probably just like shooting shit and like just saying whatever comes to her mind. But she's
Yeah.
like craps on academics so hard in here, whereas like, these people are like, tell me what the authority said. Give me a list of what people have written about your book. And she's like, why? Like,
Yeah.
why would you even want to read that? Read the book on your own and, do that. And they're like, no, no, no. In academia, you have to have sources. And she's like, that's dumb. Everyone should know
Yeah.
that's dumb.
You don't like
Amazing.
you don't need a source to inform your personal reaction to a book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer of this. But then she talks a little bit about critics, which I thought was very interesting too, where she's like, well, the critics are all
Also.
screwy because everything we're taught is that there's something better than something else. And like there's a winner and a loser and a first place, and this writer is past that writer. And so criticism is about that kind of idea of failure and of success, and that you're trained into that way of thinking. Which I thought that was really great to hear and is interesting because like that should be the opposite of criticism, but also like that is that's kind of part of our culture in a lot
Yeah.
of ways.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things I also really liked about the introduction is when she talks about um something that we say at Open Letter a lot, which is especially in terms of translations, that a book, a text, a novel, a book is a living, breathing thing. And so she even talks about, or is it her, or the character Anna? No, even the character Anna talks about like the first time you read a book. And a book that you read in your 20s might serve you differently when you read it again in your 30s. And it might not serve you at all, and that's fine. And it's like having one person or like a group of people, critics, just speak at large and at length about your book when it comes out. It's not super helpful for the readership or for the critic really either, because you're in a moment of time reacting to something. So I do love that she points out um, that it's, yeah, like you're saying, it's kind of like not moot, but it's just sort of like why?
Yeah, I'm not finding it in here now, but I thought it was in the intro that there's a line where basically she's like, "Well, contemporary writing is just about information. Like
Yeah.
this book has like a style and a structure to it, but most contemporary writing is just like essentially journalism. Like
Hmm.
you're just telling what is there before you and what happened to you and what went on, and that's what's important is the conveyance of information, which is something that comes up a lot. And I was talking about today with the translation students, and that like a translation is like they if you lose sight of the artistic goal and the fact the intent the artistic intent behind something in creation, then you're just like translating information. I'm giving you the
Yeah.
information about what's on this page or in this sentence rather than the kind of artifice of it. So with the book itself, anything else from the intro that you wanted to talk about?
I mean, I wanna, it might end up being one of my favorite, like my favorite line of the week, but on the last page of the introduction, I don't fuck with Roman numerals. So it's the last page of the introduction,
27.
second half, um, where she's talking about letters that people are writing her. And like letter one talks about this, letter two talks about this, letter three talks about this, but they're all talking about the same book. Um, And she says that, and naturally, these incidents bring up again questions of what people see when they read a book, and why one person sees one pattern and nothing at all of another pattern, and how odd it is to have, as author, such a clear picture of a book that is seen so very differently by its readers.
Yep.
And from this kind of thought has emerged a new conclusion, which is that it is not only childish of a writer to want readers to see what he sees, to understand the shape and aim of a novel as he sees it. His wanting this means that he has not understood a most fundamental point. And this is the line, which is that the book is alive and potent and fructifying and able to promote thought and discussion only when its plan and shape and intention are not understood. Because that moment of seeing the shape and plan and intention is also the moment when there isn't anything more to be got out of it. And I think that ties very loosely back to Empire of the Senseless as well, where like for me, as someone who did not enjoy that book, I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah.
No, I mean, truly and earnestly, I think it's interesting to talk about it. And that the idea of like a good book lives on so long as nobody gets it 100%. And that's a really, that could be a dangerous thought, especially for MFA writers
Yeah.
of like it's fine, but also um that's really appealing to me as a reader. I really, really like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So I'm all in. I'm balls to the wall for Doris Lessing.
There we go. So the book is split up into the structure is evident from the table of contents. So
Mhm.
we're talking about there are five sections that are free women, sections 1 through 5. Each has like a little tagline as to like what's going to happen. So Free Women 1, which we were talking about today, is Anna meets her friend Molly in the summer of 1957 after a separation. And then you get the notebooks, and then there are four notebooks. Black, what is it? Black, red, yellow, blue.
Yeah.
Um, and then in between Free Women 4 and Free Women 5, after those notebooks, is the Golden Notebook, which we will get to when we get to. So there's kind of like two sections to each chapter. One that is the Free Women, and then one is like her personal writings. And these are, as we find out, diaries that she's keeping, and that there are four of them because they each have a different sort of topic or theme to them. And the her in question is Anna Wolf.
Hmm.
And she has written one novel, which is extraordinarily successful bestseller. And I forget what the title of it is.
Frontier of War or Frontiers of War.
Frontiers of War is made into a movie, or is maybe made into a movie, or
They they people want it to be made into a
people
movie.
want it to be.
Yeah, she's like in talks with agents. Agents keep like whining and dining her
Hmm. And
and
it's a
wanting her to do thing.
And it's a book about Central Africa that we'll get to in a minute, because it is more in the notebook section than in this first opening. In the first opening, Anna meets up with her friend Molly. Molly's been gone for a year. She left her like 19-year-old son Tommy to live on his own in London and in her flat as she went off to Europe to have a quote unquote gay old time. Um, which apparently she did. They are both Anna and Molly have like a strange frenemy situation between them, but they are both part of the Communist Party in Britain, but have fallen away from it to one degree or another. I think they fall away more maybe later on, in fact, but they're both like sort of dissatisfied with the Communist Party, which is one of those things that like historically that was a very different period when you're talking about being a communist or a socialist,
Yeah.
and being both a member of something that is very much real. I'll talk about this in a second too when we get to her letters. But the the it's a organization. They're having meetings. They're having like thoughtful political conversations about how to change the future, and are also like obviously like kind of outlawed in various ways on the fringes because it's a Cold War. If you're a communist, you're sympathizing with Russia. Russia is bad, but we can't say Russia is bad if we're a communist because we have to believe in this whole thing. It's very good, becomes very dogmatic in the 50s and not very enlightening. And there's like certain like frames of things here where she's like, oh, well, I guess I'd say as a socialist. And even in her notebook, she's like, Ted was the real socialist among us. He was like high upper class, didn't have, had nothing to do with the Communist Party officially, but he's the one who would go out and try and like help the poor and like help people who didn't have his
Yeah.
privileges and take them in and do like the true like socialist activities. Like there's like a conflation of all these phrases at our moment in time where like especially like back when like Bernie Sanders was more actively running, where it's like, oh well, he's just a commie. Everyone's a commie. And like the I think the historical usage of that term and the way that people were members of the Communist Party is very different than saying today like I believe in socialist values in a
Yeah.
way because it's a
Yeah.
it's a different situation.
And I
Um,
think I think really quickly that's something that she also touches on in her introduction. I believe it's in the introduction where it's like people forget that like communism didn't start out as an evil. It started out as like people wanting to do good.
yeah, yeah, that's very true. So Molly and Anna like are hanging out, talking, trying to catch up. Anna has things to say. They both had the same psychoanalyst, which may come up again later. Uh,
Mother sugar.
Mother Sugar. Anna doesn't care for Mother Sugar. Molly's a little defensive of Mother Sugar. They kind of a push and pull with like one of the vendors down in the street. That's a little weird and classist. And that's one of the other things that comes through in this book a lot is like the class structures, I think.
Yeah.
Like that's very evident and gets referred to very British, middle of the century.
Yeah.
Um, Anna's not writing another book, but Anna, Molly was away, Molly's ex-husband, Richard, who's the father of Tommy, Richard is remarried someone named Marion, who's a raging alcoholic, has like three kids of his own. But Richard and Marion and Tommy all start confiding in Anna, which is maybe the kind of main crux of this first part to some
Yes.
degree. And so
Yeah.
she's trying to talk to Molly about all sorts of things, but Molly's kind of like, I don't know, Molly's a little flighty, little
Yeah,
wants to be
she's
the center of
all over the
attention,
place.
wants to
I
like
mean,
wants to fight.
yeah, I mean she's been back in the country for a week, I think it was.
Something very short. Yeah, she's back for a
Yeah.
very short period of time.
She's like, ugh, this air, these people, blah.
Yeah, I do want to go back and they talk frequently about marriage. This is the other thing that's important is like Anna is not married. Or she was married
Yes.
briefly
That's how she ended up in Africa.
in Central Africa. Although,
Yeah.
wait, did she actually get married or she went down there to get married and then was like,
Yes.
"Oh,
No,
I'm out."
she I that was a part that I missed I mean, it's such a blip, but so she marries a man named Stephen,
Stephen.
who I think did like agriculture or farming, and he
Hmm.
was in England on holiday when they met and they got married, and she followed like went back with him and was like, "Ooh, no,
No thanks.
this is not for me," but she stuck around anyway, and
Starts
that's a,
working
a
as like a
theme as well.
secretary and getting involved with the people at this
Yeah.
particular hotel and bar, who then become
Yes.
characters in her novel that
Yes,
she
with the
fictionalizes into her novel. So
yes.
in this part, just to put these layers together, we have and Richard, just to put in the plot part of it, Richard comes to visit. Most of this chapter is taken up by Richard, Molly, and Anna having a debate, conversation, argument. Barbs are thrown about Tommy, and in fact, that Tommy doesn't really seem to have a purpose in life. And there's the tension of like Oh yeah, he grew up around you, Molly, with all your, pinko friends talking all this stuff about politics and socialism and communism. So of course he's like, listen, now that you two aren't really that active in it, what's he supposed to do? He needs to join in business with me, and I can put him in business and he'll make lots of money. And nobody's really talking to Tommy necessarily. And Anna's like, he doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to be you. He doesn't want to be us. He wants to be
Yeah.
like his own thing. Maybe you could find like something that's of value to do with society, like UNESCO or something that
Yeah.
he could work at. Um, and so most of the is about that. There's also you get to find out that an interesting psychological part that Anna almost sleeps with Richard, but doesn't. But then also like has a respect for him that his ex-wife doesn't, because she has like seemingly no idea what he does or how much money or
Yes.
power he has. She's like
Yeah.
oblivious to it.
Yes. And I do, and it's not a spoiler, but I do know that there is a scene later on where Anna, I think it goes back, but when she does go to see Richard in his office, and that's where I think she sort of understands, like, wow, he's not just like the capitalist goon we've been like saying he is for the past 19 years. Like he actually like means something. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean that he's doing anything of substance, but he means something.
Right, right, right.
And they have not taken advantage of that.
And they do the part of it like Molly and Richard, which seem like an unlikely couple, given like her kind of bohemian leanings and his very capitalist ones, meet in
Yeah.
Spain when they're on the side of the Republican Party, the more communist leaning party, if not straight up communist. And but then afterwards, Richard's like, that was foolishness. I'm back to being in business, got my
Yeah.
family, got my money, gonna do my businessy things.
Yep.
So yeah, so there's a lot of tension in this conversation too about like the part where she's like, it's not just like a war of the sexes thing is true,
Mhm.
but this section has, a lot of that's built in there over like what
Yeah.
we can't do and how they're perceived.
Yeah. And one thing that we haven't said yet is that this is not like England is still being rebuilt from the war. Like they
Hmm.
very clearly says with Molly's apartment, like the roof was blown in
Yeah.
or like the roof caught some shrapnel and it was patched. So like, I think these women are very independent and and Anna keeps going back to it and she keeps going back to how they have chosen
Hmm.
this lot in life. Like they have chosen to be single mothers, they have chosen this independence. But I think there is that undercurrent, and Anna sort of hints at it where she's like, but like, don't we kind of actually still want to be married? Like,
Right.
but I don't think it quite gets into the meat of why if it's for the safety or the structure or the stability or the partnership. But that comes up so often is that Anna's like, we chose this.
Yeah. And Anna doesn't have a kid. You said single mothers, but she's
She
childless.
does.
She
She
does?
does.
She
Yeah,
does.
Janet is her
Oh,
daughter.
Janet. Yeah. Okay. That's right. Sorry. I forgot because Janet just gets dropped in here. And I was like, Janet. Okay. Oh, yeah, that's right.
Janet is also the name of like a Persian cat.
Yeah.
And it's late teens. It is not
Yeah.
really the name of a child, but
So
that's fine.
there we go. Yeah. So the choice thing is very important, I think, for that too. And you're right. Like she does bring it up a lot of like, we do still want to be married, don't we? Or something, but
Yeah.
that's unclear as to why.
It's like all the bitching and moaning. It's like it's fun to bitch and moan, but we chose this. Like we did this to ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. There is also too the what comes up and is very like concrete and simplistic though is that Richard's having affairs nonstop. Like
Oh
they have
yeah.
a confrontation in here where they're talking about Tommy and what happened to Tommy growing up, and with Marion who's like cracked up and is like as one of the themes of like the a couple of themes that Lessing points to of like the cracking up and like the breakdown is like a sort of form of therapy in some ways,
Yeah.
and also like having writer's block, which Anna sort of has. She's
Yeah.
not writing another novel; she's doing something else. But one of the things, like, so they start talking about Marion and how Richard was like nice to Marion and loved her up until she started having a kid, and then he just started banging away at every every port or whatever that he
Yeah.
could,
Yep.
people after people, but yet like would totally object. He says that he's not going. He's like, oh, you should take a lover, Marion. Like, I've got a bunch of lovers. You need a lover, someone who can like appreciate you. And so she does, and he flips out and like ruins that, and is like, nah, only I'm going to be having affairs in this house. There's only room for one philanderer.
Yeah, yeah. And the description of the like not the honeymoon, but like the apology moon that he takes her on after she has this, where he's like, you don't understand, like Anna and Molly, like, you guys don't understand how hard, like, how am I supposed to get a hard on? How do I get a boner when this woman hates me and is watching me like a hawk? It's like she's watching me to wait for me to slip and check out some woman's butt, and I keep waiting for her to like take a drink of whiskey. Like, this is how do I get hard in this
Yep.
emotional hostage situation?
It's very
And they're basically just
funny.
like, you fucked your way into it. Like they have zero empathy for him. And I love that.
I know, and they really do rag on him, and he just has to take it
Yeah.
because he's like such a buffoon in so many ways in here. Like, I know that Anna keeps saying, like, the dude's got a lot of power that you're not really recognizing in terms of like what
Yeah.
he means to industry, quote unquote, and money and capital.
Yeah.
But like at the same time, they're just like dismissive of him in every way.
They're
Like,
like, yeah,
whatever,
oh
Richard.
Richard. Oh Richard. You
Oh, Mr. Dick. You can get out of here. That there so yeah, so there's lots of things we could say about that in terms of like what they talk about. I know we're kind of running up against it and not too long. But
well, I wanted to, and we can talk about this next week when Brian is on too, but I at least want to put a pin in the all of the like nearly playwrighty like Anna's observations of like Molly, how Molly moves her hands and like Molly speaking with her hands and these
mhm,
quiet gesticulations, or Anna saying something and as she's saying realizing that it sounds harsh and so she tries to undercut it with a
yep,
smile or a laugh. Like, those are put in there initially. For me it seemed a little jarring, but at the same time it's it's helpful. But like, holy shit, like being on all the time is exhausting, like that, of
yeah.
like you can't even completely be yourself with your best friend of like 11 years. You're just constantly thinking and overthinking every move you make and every move they make.
Yeah, yeah. That kind of hyper awareness of everything is very true. I want to talk about Tommy. One other thing with the Communist Party, going back to it. So Anna's sort of fallen away from it. Although she's kept up to date. She has a lot of gossip and like information about who's there. But part of the reason that she becomes like disinterested was that they weren't willing to admit that things were fucked up in Russia. That things were not going good. You can't say that. You have to stay with this. And then she receives like a bunch of letters. Anna receives the letters that she talks about to Molly, right?
Yes.
Where
Yeah.
she gets a series of letters being like, "You can't do this," and then a series of letters, three letters from three different people. They're all almost identical in terms of their phrasing and thinking about like that's not the way to act. Then a second one being like self like hatred filled and like apologetic and like whatnot from these same three guys, written with the same language, the same bit, and then in another letter from the same three guys a little bit later that has a whole new like here's our principle, here's our line on these things. And she's like, these aren't individuals. This could have been written. She types them out. She's like, these could have been all written by the same person. They're all like the same thing. And they're just like anonymous. Like you just become part of this anonymous body and are no
Yeah.
longer an individual. You are like just reciting these slogans and this way
Yeah.
of being. And that's like super just like puts her off. And so
Yeah.
that part of like the communist program that's not necessarily like, you know, the infighting that exists, but it kind of is, but also the like erasure that you have to
Yeah.
follow these rules, that you have to follow in the line. That part of communism and the Communist Party at that time is really, bad. Um,
Yeah.
in terms
Absolutely.
of like that's not really the values that one wanted to uphold, but like there's all the systems that go into like how would communism actually function? We need to figure this out. Lead to like little mini dictatorships. This came up in that book, the Diamela El Tit book, and that came to my mind frequently as I was reading this because after the conversation with Tommy, which let's come back to. We do get part of the Black Notebook for this week, and the Black Notebook is basically about her novel and about how she goes down to Africa, like we said with Steve, divorces him or just whatever, leaves him, works in the city as like a secretary, gets involved with all these different people, and becomes like the girlfriend of Willie, the main communist kind of party leader in that part of the world. And
Yeah.
she refers to how she's kind of like they never really love each other. They don't really hate each other. They're just like kind of have to be next to each other. And she's like the woman that's the party leader's girlfriend. And there's like
Yeah.
a little bit of that reminded me of DMLLT, in the sense that, that book had the same kind of like all these issues with like the communist, the revolutionary party, and the sort of like weird love hate kind of tension between these two people.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's and yeah, even saying girlfriend is like I like reading it a second time now, I'm like, okay, no, like they're involved, but it's like it's not even a romantic involvement. It's like involvement by like physically political. I don't even know how you would, you don't need to label it, but it's fascinating.
It's like a
And
level of inertia.
yeah, and and they're not the only ones because it talks about, it starts to introduce some of the other people, or it does introduce the other people who she was involved with and who were in that same boat, and like the pilots,
Hmm.
um and how I think even talk, yeah, just it's so fucking fascinating. I love it. I love the dynamics of how she describes these relationships, how
Yeah.
Doris Lessing describes these relationships, and even the one of the two guys, I think it's Paul, I think it's is it Paul and Villy or Paul and Tom? Like, no, maybe it's Tom and Villy, where it's like she's like thinking, Anna's like thinking about it now. They like, would sort of razz each other sometimes, but they never actually like talked. Like,
Mm,
so like how can I say this was like a group of friends, or
right.
like a group is a cohesive unit, and we were just like there together.
Yeah. So
So fucking love it.
let's move to that locale after just one last point. So we're still in Molly's house. Her, Anna, and Richard are there. Tommy's been listening in his room at his door for at least some point in time. He comes out to all of them and confronts them and is basically like, "So you've been talking about me, huh?" 20-year-old kid been brooding, quote unquote. Brooding is the word they like to use. And he's like using Anna's advice where she was like, just go and think about it. And so he's like, I'm going to go think. So he like, quote unquote, broods there. And basically is like, Dad, I don't want to be you because the second I start being you, that is everything. You are your career. We never say like Anna the writer or Molly the actress, but we do say like Richard the businessman, and like that you are defined by your career. And I don't want to be defined by a career, which is very like astute and like good thinking.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the way he says it gives me like cringe of like he's such a smart kid, and then him just being like again like, so if it's all the same to you, I'd like to just continue not doing anything for a few months. It's cheaper than university, and you're like, fucker, but he's right. Damn
Like,
it. Damn
yes.
it.
He also seems to know, and some of his dad's got enormous wealth, so and is
Oh yeah.
powerful enough that this is not an issue.
Yeah, for sure.
But I like how he like he takes shots at his dad rather frequently too. And then his dad's like, Marion's fine. He's like, oh really? That's not what she was like when I saw her for coffee yesterday. Like he's like Tommy's awesome. He's he's like
Like everyone's having coffee with everyone else. Like I love that when they're all like, "Oh, Anna's the one who to whom everyone is running for their stuff," and then Tommy drops his like, "Well, I just had coffee with her yesterday, and she seemed pretty not. She
yeah,
seemed pretty wrecked, Dad."
yeah, well, whatever. It's it's pretty awesome. I really like that. I really like
And
his appearance. Like his appearance reminds me of in Tirza by Arnon Grunberg. Everything's going along in the first chapter in a particular way, and it's like hitting these kind of beats that are like this kind of mid-century novelistic beats, and then suddenly a kid arrives, and that kid just tears apart like how the whole scene works. And in this sense, Tommy does the same thing. They're having this like very like Anthony Poole, who's the other person I'm thinking of? Oh my God, Evelyn Waugh sort of like, conversational British thing where there's like edginess and like bars, but they're all like doing it in this proper way. And then Tommy shows up and is basically like, yeah, nope, not not doing it that way, buddies.
Tommy shows up and proceeds to silently make himself a bowl of strawberries and cream and then silently eat it and nobody fucking says a word.
They just wait.
They
I'm going
just
to be here.
wait.
Here
Like that
now.
is diabolical. Like
Yeah, solid. Love it. So then we get to our notebooks. I don't know if there's anything else to say about that section per se. It's a good setup. We were introduced to those three main characters and Marion as a fourth on that's off screen.
yeah.
Um, there's like all the little like sexual innuendos and the fact that like they all like as free women do have like a free like sexuality is part of that definitely for both
Yeah.
of them. And that's important to note. But otherwise, like Richard's always trying to put them in boxes. They don't want to fit in those boxes. There is some sort of shame level of like, man, we spent a lot of time in this communist thing, and it probably wasn't the best. Which I think is interesting because I don't remember this for certain, but I think the communist thing sort of fades away a little bit later on in the book. Like it's not as like as omnipresent, but I might be wrong about that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember just the from the frontiers of war or
Yeah.
from no, I guess it's Anna's like the recounting of being in Central Africa, but um
So yeah, so then we get her notebooks, and the notebook that we get describes the four, and then we get the black one for this section, in which the narrator describes that in each of these notebooks there's like a lot of rambling, and then it comes to like its theme, and the theme for the black one is the dark, and then was divided into two sides of the page, source and money. Source being like where the information about frontiers of war came from, like who were the real people, what was like her inspiration so on and so forth. And money is every transaction involved with like the sales of that book, the like translations of that book, the everything else of that book. And then she, like you said earlier, she is interested in making it a movie. She has to meet with agents. She's like, "This is dumb. I don't want to do this. This is silly." She ends up writing. It sounds like someone's purchased it. She writes like a spec script of sorts that's like a parody of it, where it's like this love story between this like fancy pilot who falls for like this. Tell me if I got this wrong. Falls for like the daughter of the owners of a hotel, but
yeah.
the owner of the hotel is the woman's also in love with him because he's so dashing. But then he gets involved with like a black cook, or daughter of a black cook, and wants to run away with her. That causes big chaos. Or it's a wife, sorry, it's the cook's wife that he wants to run away with. That causes big chaos, but they like meet and like have some sort of like passing moment as like he goes on with his life and she stays there, and it's all like very trite. Like I read that description, I was like, this is so fucking trite. Like this
Yeah.
sounds like a terrible, terrible like Hallmark sort of movie. And then
Yeah.
she's like, the agent loved it, but I was like, that's a parody. I wasn't trying to like write a real thing. This is a joke version of like the story that I wrote. But it is
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's what would get greenlit, yo. That would get
Yeah.
totally greenlit.
And the title of the movie be Forbidden Love. Like
Forbidden Love, yeah,
stop.
100%. That's so funny. Oh, it's right here. It's not in the intro. This is the part that I was looking for, where she's talking about in her notebook, talking about she's making up fake reviews for herself, in which they're basically like critical of her own writing and her own abilities. And then says at one point on page 58, the point is that the function of the novel seems to be changing. It has become an outpost of journalism. We read novels for information about areas of life we don't know. Nigeria, South Africa, the American Army, a coal mining village, coteries in Chelsea, etc. We read to find out what is going on. One novel in 500 or 1,000 has a quality a novel should have to make it a novel, the quality of philosophy. Then later, she goes on to say, human beings are so divided, are becoming more and more divided, and more subdivided in themselves, reflecting the world that they reach out desperately, not knowing they do it, for information about other groups inside their own country, let alone about other groups in other countries. Later on, if there is one thing we can be sure of, it is that competent and informative novels will continue to pour from the publishing houses. And that was the part that I associated that with Doris Lessing in the intro. So
Yeah.
apologies to everyone who's listening to this and is like, "You're an idiot. You're an idiot." It's later on. Notebooks. Read
I
the book,
mean,
buddy.
that 1971 intro and these first 80 pages are pretty inextricable
Yeah.
from one another. Like it does blend. It blends very much.
the tone and the writing is the same. Like the
Yeah.
the a lot of like the that first part of the Free Women where it's like clearly going to be a novel is being a novel is very much a novel in that vein of like British writing around that time. Like it feels
Mhm.
influenced not necessarily by that. It feels like influenced by like I know she references Dostoevsky a few times in like her writings and maybe in the introduction
Yeah.
like sort of like that, and also with that kind of like interior domesticity of that British novel at that time, where like things are spoken or not spoken, there are a lot of conversations, so on and so forth. So the Black Notebook goes on then to like describe like eventually she gets off that and starts talking about like where did this come from, and when she goes down, like we said, to get married, does not. Ends up with this group of people, include Billy or Willie, however you're supposed to say it, who is both himself and his opposite at all points in time, and is a person that she's involved with, and then involves like a few other main characters. The only one that I think I want to talk about before we have to go is Paul Blackenhurst, who is the young man I used in Frontiers of War for the character of the gallant young pilot, full of enthusiasm and idealism. Um, Paul's charming, beautiful. Everyone likes him. He does all this stuff, and then Paul walks into a plane and gets cut to pieces.
Yeah, that the fucking foreshadowing all these people have for themselves is like it's intense. It's so intense. But yeah, Paul walks into a plane.
Yeah, it reminds me of that. There's an episode of ER where the guy walks into the propeller of a helicopter and gets his like arm chopped off. It's like it's described like that. Like he gets drunk, he's leaving, he gets way wasted, shows up the next day, still wasted, and just walks into a propeller, loses his
Like you
legs, and
do.
dies.
This is
Boom.
why this is why you need sunglasses.
Shit. This is yeah, yeah. So yeah, so then there's Jimmy. There's also then uh Ted, who we talked about, and then there's Mary. Is it Mary Jane? That's referenced, but she has not gotten a lot of characterization yet. But basically, they're all there. Um,
Mary Rose?
Mary Rose, that's what it is. Mary Rose, and
Something like very Catholic sounding.
yeah, so Mary Rose, so they're a group of people that have some sort of like connection to like Willie is a communist, is the communist outpost in that part. They're sort of attracted to that. Also, like they are the kind of the people living there, the expats from Britain of various classes, like upper middle class, and they're hanging out. And the only thing that happens so far in this section is that they end up going to a different hotel to try and check out another hotel. Otherwise, this is total scene setting, but is interesting in the sense that we get the novel part, and then the notebook. There's a lot of notebooky shit, like a lot of diary, discordant, like not pieced together. Things are stuck in there according to the descriptions. There's like lines drawn, things written in fragments, and then the beginning of this, like here's who we were. I can't believe who we were back at that time, and so that's what we're leading into for next week.
It kind of sounds like junk journaling.
Oh God, that is true, I suppose. And the for next week we are going up to page 159, which in 159 the ending break on this, depending on what I think most of these are the same pagination, but I'm not sure about the UK version. But on 159 in the American version, it ends with like one of the little dinkuses that looks like I don't know what that's supposed to be. It looks a little bit like grass, and then begins Jean Barker, wife of minor party official. So it's not a completely clean ending, but this at least ends at a spot that looks like a spot to stop at and put a bookmark in instead of where we ended today. The other thing I want to say before we go is that Danny Hahn, translator extraordinaire, winner of the Ottaway Prize, sent me read our post about this and sent me a video of he has a book by Paulo Coelho, famous Brazilian author, famous like sort of like bullshit artist in some ways in terms of his like psychology and spiritual things. Um, but in the book that Danny has, when you open up the front cover, there's a huge picture of Doris Lessing on the side. Where like,
Amazing. Love it.
Paulo Coelho cover, Doris Lessing. So there's that. That's a good thing too. Otherwise, do you have a favorite line other than one that you read so far?
Um, give me,
Give
yeah.
give you this is not good radio. Beep.
No, I know. Oh, I guess I liked some of this. I like some of the sentiments. So on page 46, um, Molly's complaining and she says, "Oh, hell," said Molly. "I can't face it, but I suppose I shall," in relation to fixing her ceiling. "Why is it? It's only in this country everybody one knows seems to put a good face on things. Everyone is bravely carrying a burden." Tears were smudging her eyes, and she blinked them away and turned back to her oven. And then Anna says, and this is my line, "Because this is the country we know. The other countries are the places we don't think in."
Oh, yeah, that's great. That's great. Um, so the part that I was going to read is from when she's talking about, I feel sick when I look at the parody synopsis at the letters in the film company. Yet I know that what made the film company so excited about the possibilities of that novel as a film is precisely what made it successful as a novel. It's about a color problem. And goes on and says, yet no one else seems to see. She says, it was so clear to me that I can't read that novel now without feeling ashamed, as if I were in a street naked. Yet no one else seems to see it. Not one of the reviewers saw it. Not one of my cultivated literary friends saw it. It is an immoral novel because that terrible lying nostalgia lights every sentence. That's my line. Is the terrible lying nostalgia lights every sentence. Brilliant. Love it. So far,
So
so good.
good.
So far,
So
so
far,
good.
so good. I'm so excited.
Enjoying it. Rocking on for another 80 pages next week.
Hell yeah.
Brian should be here. We'll talk about some early reviews, get his thoughts on. The only message he sent me was Fountainhead is greater than the Golden Notebook. Anyways, you can follow us on Instagram or Blue Sky. You can, rate and review this podcast at YouTube if you're watching us on YouTube, and also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Those things really help. Any review that you have would be very, very, very welcome. We'll be back next week with this crazy Fountainhead conversation and more. Talk to you later.
Bye.